Today our topic is types of reasoning, and mainly we are going to discuss the deductive and inductive methods of reasoning. Before discussing types of reasoning, let's first define what reasoning is. Reasoning is the capability of the brain to take inputs from all the five senses and actually make sense out of it. So what is reasoning is that we get the input through our five senses and put information together and make some sense out of this information and convert into something which has some meanings. These are the five senses we have. Number one is our eyes, our ear, our hands, our touching, and our smell, sense of smelling, and then taste. So these we are getting information from the environment through these five senses to use for our reasoning. Reasoning and logic. In philosophy, reasoning is the capacity of consciously making sense of things, employing logic and adopting or justifying practices, institutions, and belief based on new or existing information. So basically, like I explained in the previous slides, it is a conscious effort of us to make sense of things and then applying logically and justifying and adopting it. These are our beliefs based on the information we have already or the information we are getting, the new information we are getting. So logic is a reasonable way of thinking about something and a science that deals with rules and processes used in sound thinking and reasoning. So what is logic? Logic is a proper or a reasonable way of thinking. So we think about things in a reasonable or a proper way, and is a science that deals with the rules and process used in sound thinking and reasoning. Now let's talk about the types of the reasoning. There are four types of reasonings. Number one is critical thinking. Number two is institution. Number three is deductive reasoning, and last one is inductive reasoning. So we will discuss one by one all these types of reasoning. Critical thinking is the analysis of facts to form a judgment. So we analyze the facts of information to come to to make a judgment. The critical thinking subject is complex and several different definitions do exist, which generally include the rational, skeptical, unbiased analysis, evaluation of factual evidence. So these are the things we should include when we are saying that we are doing critical thinking. The first one is thinking should be rational, reasonable, proper, reasonable. Then so we have also always doubt about the things, that is these are true or not true or useful or unuseful, and then our analysis should be unbiased. We shouldn't have any bias or inclination toward any particular idea or thing, and then evaluation of the factual evidence, what is existing on the ground. So this is the part of critical thinking. Intuition is a thing that one knows or considers likely from instinctive feeling rather than conscious reasoning. So intuition is basically done without conscious thought. When we have any feeling or any thinking which has no conscious thinking, so we think like unconsciously, is called intuition. An instinctive feeling, idea or action is one that you have or do without thinking or reasoning. It is and absolutely instinctive reaction. If a child falls, you pick it up. Some action you do without thinking, because this is like it is in your institution, so you have to do that. It is natural, inborn, automatic, and unconscious. Intuition is the ability to acquire knowledge without recourse to conscious reasoning. So basically intuition is the ability to acquire the knowledge without proving that, so or doing any conscious reasons. Intuition is a process that gives us the ability to know something directly without analytic reasoning, bridging the gap between the conscious and non-conscious parts of our mind, and also between instinct and reason. So basically intuition is not based on any reasoning or things like that. So it is like your feeling. You just feel about things and you say that. So it's called intuition. After defining critical thinking and intuition, let's discuss the main method of reasoning in philosophy or in all other field of knowledge. Those are deductive and inductive. In logic, we often refer to the two broad methods of reasoning as the deductive and inductive approaches. Deductive reasoning works from more general to a more specific way. So in deductive methods, we move from generalization to specification, and inductive reasoning works the other way around, and moving from specific observation to broader generalization and the theories. So these are the basic difference between these two methods. One is from general to specific, and other is like from specific to broader. Let's discuss deductive reasoning first. Deductive reasoning works from the more general to the more specific. Sometimes this is informally called as top-down approach. So we also call this approach a top-down because we come from top to bottom. We might begin with thinking up a theory about our topic of interest. First we start thinking about a theory of our topic in which we have interest. We then narrow that down into more specific hypotheses that we can test. So then we reach to a more particular thing, and we develop a hypothesis, and then we test that, and we narrow down even further when we collect observation to address the hypothesis. So this ultimately leads us to able to test the hypothesis with specific data, a confirmation or not of our original theory. So what we do, we select a topic and we read about that, and then reach to a specific statement or hypothesis from our reading, from our knowledge, and then we test it that it is true or it is not true, and we confirm or so the original theory. So this is called the deductive reasoning, and we use this in most of the researches we do. Here is a picture of showing the steps in deductive reasoning. First is the theory, and then hypothesis, and then observation, and then confirmation. So this is like from top to bottom. So we have a broader idea, then we have to reach to a specific, and then we observe the data, and then we confirm or not confirm the things what we are doing. And this is the way we reason about the things, that things are right or things are not right. Before going to the next method or approach of the reasoning, let's define these terms which we have discussed: the theory, hypothesis, observation, and confirmation in the next slides. Theory is a supposition, a belief held without proof or certain knowledge, an assumption, or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles, independent of things to be explained. So this is the definition of theory. So we have some belief, but we are not certain, and we use some assumptions and especially one based on general principles. So it is a generally saying thing. So a theory is a contemplative, thoughtful and rational types of abstract or generalization thinking about a phenomena or a result of such thinking. The process of contemplative and rational thinking often is associated with such process like the observational study or research. Hypothesis is a supposition or proposed explanation made on basis of limited evidence as a starting point for the further investigation. So we from theory we go to the hypothesis where we have a limited not complete evidence for that particular statement or supposition we are saying. A hypothesis is a proposed explanation for a phenomena. Proposed mean what we are thinking with our limited evidence. So for a hypothesis to be scientific hypothesis, the scientific method requires that one can test it. So it should hypothesis have one of the characteristics that it should be tested, that is right or it is not right. So scientists generally base scientific hypothesis on previous observation that cannot satisfactorily be explained with the available scientific theories. So usually they are there, these statements or informations, but they are not proved properly. So the scientists try to prove that or disprove the knowledge or the information. Observations. This is the action or the process of closely observing or monitoring something or someone. So observation is the active acquisition of information from a primary source. So when we collect the information from a primary source, mean we get the information ourselves, not we are reading from somewhere. So that's called primary source. So when we are getting this information by watching it or by just observing it, so that's called observation. In living beings, observations apply the senses. In science, observation can also involve the perception or recording of data via the use of scientific instruments. So we can use our own senses or scientific tools to record the information or scientific data to reach to a calculation. So that's called observations. Next is confirmation, a statement or proof that something is true. The action of confirming something or state of being confirmed. The process of getting the summary of the findings reviewed by study participants more likely is confirmations. So after developing a hypothesis, testing them with observations, and then with your scientific reasoning you proved it or disprove it. So this is called confirmation. The next approach of reasoning is inductive reasoning, and it works other way to the deductive reasoning approach, and it moves away from specific observation to broader generalization or the theory. Informally, we sometimes call it bottom up approach. So that was like from top to bottom, and it was like bottom to top. So in inductive reasonings, we begin with specific observation and then measure it, and then begin to deduct patterns and regularities, formulate some tentative hypotheses that we can explore, and finally end up developing some general conclusion or the theories. So it works other way around than the deductive. So in deductive we go from general to specific. Here we go from specific to generalizations. So in inductive reasoning we observe something and then find out if there is any pattern in our observation, and then when we find some pattern we say tentative hypothesis, and then we test that hypothesis, and then that hypothesis become a theory. So from our observation, specific observation, we make a generalized things after checking its patterns and developing a tentative hypothesis and testing them. So let's define what the pattern is, which we have used the word patterns. That in inductive reasoning we see that after observing something and defining if there is any pattern in our observation. So a pattern is a regularity in the word in human-made design or in abstract idea. As such, the elements of pattern repeat in a predictable manner. So basically pattern is when any action or anything is repeating itself in a predictable manner in a particular sequence. So that's called patterns. So a geometric pattern is kind of pattern, a form of geometric shapes and typical repeated like a wallpaper design. Any of the sense may directly observe patterns. So if there's any pattern, your eye can find out that there's a pattern in any phenomena. So it's called patterns. After discussing each of these reasoning approach, let's discuss them and compare these two approaches. So deductive versus inductive reasoning. These two methods of reasoning have a very different feel to them when you are conducting research. Inductive reasoning by its very nature is more open-ended and exploratory, especially at the beginning. So but the deductive reasoning is more narrow in nature and is concerned with the testing and confirming the hypothesis. Even though a particular study may look like it is a purely deductive, that is an experiment designed to test the hypothesized effects of some treatment on some outcome. Most social research involve both inductive and deductive reasoning process at the same time in the project. So sometimes it looks that we are purely using one method, but actually we are using both methods to reach to a final calculation. So in fact, it does not take a rocket scientist to see that we could assemble the two graphs in in fact, it does not take a rocket scientist to see that we could assemble the two graphs in previous slides into a single circular one that continually cycles from theories down to observation and back up again to the theories. Even in the most constrained experiment, the researcher may observe pattern in the data that lead them to develop new theories. So this is a picture showing the both approaches of reasoning we are using, and it's completing the cycle of our research or our reasoning. So here is it's a cycle or is a comparison of deduction versus induction. So theory, hypothesis, observation, and confirmation. In deduction, in induction, we observe things, we see the pattern, and then we have a tentative hypothesis, and then we have the theory. So these are the two way of approaching to reasoning. Finally, after this lecture, these are the takeaway of our lecture. Deductions gets you to a perfect calculation, but only if your premises are 100% correct. So in deduction approach, we might get a perfect result, but for that we need to have our all assumptions should be 100% correct. Deduction moves from theory to experiment to validation, where induction moves from observation to generalization to theory. Then deduction is harder to use outside of the lab or science setting because it's often hard to find a set of fully agreed upon facts to structure the argument. So for deduction methods, we need a lab or a structured place or a structured setup to argue. Induction is used constantly because it is a great tool for everyday problem that deal with the partial information about our world and coming up with the usable calculation that may not be right at all the cases. So induction is like we always induce our ideas, we see the things, what's happening around us, and then we reach to some conclusion. Be willing to use both types of reasoning to solve problems, and know that they can often be used together cyclically as a pair. That is, use induction to come up with a theory and then use deduction to determine if it's actually true. So we are using both these methods or approaches to reach to check each other things. So the main thing is to avoid with these two is to arguing with the force of deduction guaranteed to be true while actually using induction probably based on the strength of evidence. So we have to avoid this, that in arguing that force of deduction, so and then actually using induction probably based on the strength of our evidence. So this was a simply explained things about the approaches we used in the reasoning in our research. You in your future, anywhere you will do the research, you will always face these two methodologies or approaches to reach to some definite results about your research.